July 4th, 1187. An arid volcanic ridge on the outskirts of Galilee. Before dawn, the silence was nearly complete. Only the rustling of armor, the creaking of dry leather, and the smell of smoke that had not yet dissipated. The sun had not yet risen, but the heat of the night had left his men with cracked lips and dry throats. Water. Everyone was thinking about water. Surrounding that elevation, called by the locals the Horns of Hattin, some 20,000 Crusader warriors awaited the dawn. They were the largest field army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled. Templar knights, Hospitallers, vassals of the realm, mercenaries and infantry soldiers. They had weapons, they had training, they had their king. They had the most sacred relic in all of Christendom, the true cross. They needed nothing else to win, except water. But the water had been cut off the day before, and the day before that. 2 days of marching 25 kilometers under the July heat without a single drop to drink, and now, surrounded, with smoke rising around the camp from where Saladin had ordered the dry brush set ablaze in the early hours of the morning, the Crusader army waited for a battle it had, technically, already lost. In a single afternoon, on that July 4th, the army was destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. King Guy of Lusignan was captured. Gérard de Riedfort, the Grand Master of the Templars, was captured. The true cross fell into enemy hands and was never seen again. The surviving Templar and Hospitaller knights were executed on the field. The common soldiers were enslaved. 87 days later, Jerusalem surrendered. The kingdom the Crusaders had built over a century of blood and iron was erased in a single summer. And here lies the paradox that will guide everything you are about to hear in this video. This army did not lose because the enemy was stronger on the battlefield. It lost because it arrived at that battlefield already destroyed, worn down by thirst, smoke, exhaustion, and a dysfunctional political system that had made, on the night before the march, the worst strategic decision of the Middle Ages. It was not steel that broke the Crusader army. It was thirst, it was smoke, and it was a council meeting that went catastrophically wrong on the night of July 2nd, 1187. And it was Saladin who had engineered this outcome years in advance. This is the story of the Battle of Hattin. And I guarantee it is not the story you think you know. The success of this trap, woven over 15 years without the victim ever noticing, lay in the Kingdom of Jerusalem's greatest blind spot. It was fragile in a way its enemies understood far more clearly than its own inhabitants ever did. The kingdom had been created in 1099 when the First Crusade captured Jerusalem. In nearly 90 years of existence, it had grown, but never enough. It was a relatively narrow strip of coastal land stretching along the eastern Mediterranean shoreline, surrounded on 3 sides by Muslim territories. Its population was small. Frankish settlers, local Christians, a few merchant communities, and none of these groups could field an army large enough to defend the territory without external reinforcements. The Crusades had created a state that was structurally dependent on a constant influx of warriors from Europe, and when that flow dwindled, the kingdom was exposed in a way that no amount of fortress building could fully compensate for. The kingdom depended on 3 things to survive. First, the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, professional monastic warriors who formed the hardened core of any Crusader force. Second, the local vassals, nobles who brought their contingents at the king's call. And third, crucially, on never losing a decisive battle. That third point deserves to be underscored, because it is what Saladin understood before any Crusader did. In a large kingdom, a defeat in the field is a setback. You lose men, you lose territory, but the state still exists. There are other forces, other regions, other resources. The Holy Roman Empire, France, England. None of them could be destroyed in a single battle. The Kingdom of Jerusalem could, because the kingdom's field army and the kingdom state were, for all practical purposes, the same thing. If the army was destroyed, there was no way to defend the fortresses. The garrisons were small, designed to hold out under siege long enough for the field army to arrive and relieve them. Without the army, the garrisons were only a matter of time. Every fortress, every city, every stretch of coastline that appeared solid and permanent was, in reality, a node in a network that depended entirely on a single center, the field army's ability to move and fight. There was one man in the kingdom who understood this with absolute clarity, and who was about to be ignored at the most critical moment. His name was Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. Raymond was one of the most seasoned nobles in the Latin East. He had spent years as a prisoner of Muslims and had developed a deep and pragmatic respect for the adversary his kingdom faced. He spoke Arabic. He understood how Saladin thought. And he knew, better than any other man in the Crusader camp, that the secret to survival lay not in winning battles, but in not losing the one battle that could never be lost. But Raymond was at a political disadvantage. The kingdom had recently undergone a transition of power, and the current king, Guy of Lusignan, had come to the throne in a controversial manner, an ascension that left deep political scars. Guy and Raymond represented rival factions, and this rivalry was not a matter of personality. It was a divide over fundamental strategy, over how the kingdom should exist in relation to the Muslim world surrounding it. For a man like Raymond, prudence was policy. For the others, it was cowardice. And there was another man, on the other side of that divide, who also understood the kingdom's fragility, but drew entirely different conclusions. Gerard de Riedfort, the Grand Master of the Templars, was a man of action, of aggression, of conviction that the Christian warrior must press forward and trust in God. These three men were about to make a decision that would destroy a kingdom. To understand how such a drastic decision was possible, why the wisest voice was ultimately ignored, and the king reversed his original choice in the dead of night, we must look at the man who spent 15 years making that disaster inevitable. Saladin. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub was not by birth a sultan of the Islamic world. He was a Kurd from a military family who had risen to power through a process of political consolidation that took more than a decade and consumed a remarkable amount of strategic patience. In the 1160s, he served as a general in Egypt, working in the service of Sultan Nur ad-Din of Damascus. When the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt collapsed, Saladin found himself in a position to fill the vacuum. By 1171, he had assumed effective control of Egypt. 2 years later, his principal superior died, and Saladin became the independent arbiter of Egyptian power. What he did next is instructive. Rather than immediately attacking the Crusader states, which would have been the obvious move for an ambitious general, Saladin spent the next 15 years consolidating the Muslim world around him. Syria, Mesopotamia, parts of Arabia, battle after diplomatic and military battle, eliminating internal rivalries, absorbing principalities, building a state that could sustain a prolonged campaign. In every negotiation, in every territorial absorption, the goal was not expansion for expansion's sake. It was to build the critical mass necessary for a definitive campaign against the Crusader states. During this period, he had confrontations with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Some resulted in Crusader victories. In 1177, at Montgisar, a far smaller Crusader army under the leper king Baldwin IV destroyed one of Saladin's contingents in open terrain, a humiliating defeat that Saladin did not forget. In 1183, he invaded the north and camped near Safaria, testing the Crusader response, observing how the enemy moved, how it resupplied, where it depended on specific water sources. What he was learning from these confrontations was not merely tactics, it was the anatomy of Crusader vulnerability. He identified 3 structural weaknesses. First, logistics. On arid terrain, in the Levantine summer, the Crusader army depended on water with an urgency that Muslim forces, who knew the land, could exploit. An army of heavily armored knights in full plate in July required enormous quantities of water. Cutting off access to water was not merely an inconvenience, it was a lethal weapon. Second, size. The kingdom simply had no strategic depth. A single lost pitched battle could be terminal. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the kingdom's internal political dynamics created a dangerous predictability. The divide between the factions was not merely ideological, it was operational. Saladin could calculate with reasonable certainty which faction would make which decision in a crisis, and that meant that if he constructed the right crisis, the outcome would be determined before the Crusader Council even convened. Saladin understood that the aggressive faction could be manipulated. If the right provocation were constructed in just the right way, it could force the king to march, regardless of what the prudent faction advised. All he needed was the right moment and the right bait. In June of 1187, he was ready. The army he had assembled was the largest he had ever commanded, clearly superior in numbers of light cavalry and mounted archers to what the kingdom could put in the field. He had chosen the moment. Summer, peak heat. He had chosen the terrain, the region north of the Sea of Galilee, where he knew every water source, every ravine, every route. He had positioned his cavalry in advance along the roads the Crusader army would have to travel. The Battle of Hattin was not improvised in the heat of the moment. It was built over 15 years, brick by brick, spring by spring, political fracture by political fracture. And there was one man in the Crusader camp who knew it. In June of 1187, Saladin crossed the Jordan with his army and moved against Tiberias, a lakeside city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. The choice of Tiberias was no accident. It was, in fact, the centerpiece of the entire plan. Tiberias lay within the territory of Raymond of Tripoli, and in the city, at that moment, was Raymond's wife. Saladin was not attacking Tiberias for its strategic value, or for what he might gain from its capture. He was attacking Tiberias to create an unsolvable political problem for Raymond. Think about the position this put the Count of Tripoli in. Raymond was the man who most clearly understood the trap Saladin was building. He was the only senior noble in the kingdom with enough experience and enough temperament to counsel against the march. But now his own wife was besieged in his own city. If he counseled against marching to save Tiberias, to let the city fall, to preserve the army and fight on favorable ground later, he would be, in the eyes of everyone on the council, recommending the abandonment of his wife to the enemy. Medieval honor did not tolerate that. Medieval politics did not tolerate that. It was a dilemma surgically constructed to silence the most rational voice on the Crusader Council. The Crusader army had been mobilized and was camped at Safaria, an excellent position. There was water, there was pasture for the horses, there was room to maneuver. If Saladin came to them, they would fight under favorable conditions. That was exactly what Saladin did not want. On the night of July 2nd, 1187, the leaders of the kingdom gathered in council. It was a meeting that would determine the fate of everything. And then something extraordinary happened. Raymond of Tripoli, the man with the besieged wife, took the floor and counseled against marching. He told the council that he knew the terrain between Safaria and Tiberias, that the route passed through arid hills with no accessible springs under the full heat of July, that Saladin had positioned cavalry along the way precisely to harass, slow down, and dehydrate the Crusader army during the march, that Tiberias, even if it fell, was only a city, and that it could be retaken later if the army survived, that the army was the only thing that could not be replaced. Raymond told the council, in essence, I know it is my wife in there, and I tell you, do not march. The city is the bait, the march is the trap. King Guy that night listened to Raymond. He agreed with the argument. He ordered the army to remain at Safaria, and then Gerard de Riedfort went to speak with him in private. What was said in that conversation, no one recorded with precision, but we know the outcome. In the early hours of July 3rd, King Guy reversed his decision. The army would march to Tiberias. Guy's sudden reversal makes sense when we examine the figure of Gerard de Riedfort. Gerard was the kind of leader who interprets caution as cowardice. As Grand Master of the Templars, the most feared military order in the Christian East, he embodied a vision of warfare founded on aggression, honor, and trust in divine protection. To Gerard, retreating in the face of a provocation was not prudence. It was weakness. It was, perhaps, betrayal. And there was political ammunition available. There were rumors, with some basis, that Raymond had reached a temporary agreement with Saladin, a local armistice that protected his county. Gerard used this as an argument. How can we trust the counsel of a man who negotiated with the enemy? How can we let the voice that preaches retreat, the voice of the man who cut a deal with Saladin, decide the fate of the kingdom? But there was something else at work there. Guy of Lusignan was a new king, with a contested reign. His legitimacy depended on appearing decisive, on showing himself as a warrior, not as someone who sat in his camp while a nobleman's wife was held hostage by the enemy. The political logic was cruel but clear. A king who refused to advance would lose the loyalty of the warriors he needed to rule. Gerard capitalized on all of it, and in the early hours of July 3, 1187, the order was given. The army would march. Raymond had explained the trap word by word. He had described the terrain, the heat, the thirst. He had put his own wife at stake to lend weight to the argument. He had said, "The city is the bait, the march is the trap." They heard all of it, and voted to march anyway. One crucial aspect defined this moment. There was no going back. Once the Crusader army left Safaria and lost access to those water sources, the defensive position was abandoned. Retreating would mean demonstrating weakness before the enemy, demoralizing the troops, and leaving the Muslim cavalry to destroy the army on the move. Because Saladin would never allow a retreating Crusader army to march freely back to safety. The only path was forward, to Tiberias, to the waters of the Sea of Galilee, 25 kilometers. The trap had closed, not physically yet, but psychologically. Every step forward was a step deeper into what would become the greatest military disaster in the history of the Crusader states. To make the irony even crueler, at the first planned stop along the route, the springs of Tehran, where the army intended to replenish its water skins, Saladin had already positioned troops to block access. The first time the Crusader army concretely realized the trap was closing was when it reached Tehran and there was no water. The march of July 3, 1187 began before the sun reached its peak. The army left Safaria in formation, infantry in the center, cavalry covering the flanks in the rear. It was a marching order designed to withstand light cavalry attacks. It was the correct formation, but the formation was designed for an army that could move. And what Saladin did that day was make movement progressively impossible. The Muslim cavalry did not attack in open formation. It attacked in waves, mounted archers who would approach within bow range, fire, and pull back before the Crusader knights could reach them. It was the same tactic that had confounded Western armies for decades. The feigned retreat, the constant harassment, the denial of a decisive battle. If the Crusader knights broke formation to give chase, they became exposed and vulnerable. If they held formation, they remained targets. And stopping was no relief either. The arrows kept coming. The only relief would be water. And the water was in Tiberias. But another factor made the situation even more catastrophic, something the tactic alone could not account for. Heat. July in Galilee does not bring mild warmth. It is an extreme climate that drains water from the body faster than any warrior trained in Europe could anticipate. The Crusader knights wore chainmail, metal armor over thick padded cloth. On a July afternoon, that armor captured and amplified the heat of the sun to the point where the metal became too hot to touch with a bare hand. Beneath it, the human body was losing liters of sweat every hour. And it was not only the men, the horses, animals that require even greater amounts of water than their riders, had also not drunk since Safaria. A dehydrated horse loses muscular capacity before showing obvious signs of collapse. First, the speed drops. Then the power. The great Crusader destriers, war horses bred specifically to carry a fully armored knight at full gallop, were hour by hour becoming animals incapable of sustaining the pace that a cavalry charge demanded. None of the knights understood yet, at that point in the march, what this would mean on the following morning. They knew only that the saddles weighed more than they should, that the animals resisted more than they should, that each kilometer cost more than the one before. Men began to fall from dehydration before midday. The infantry was the first to begin to disintegrate. Foot soldiers, with less protection and more exposure to the sun, with water skins that would run dry long before Tiberias, began to stop obeying formation orders. Some tried to press closer to the cavalry, which at least offered some protection against the archers. Others simply stopped walking. Officers shoved them back into formation, not because there was any real choice, but because the formation was the only thing still separating an army from a mob. And a mob, on that terrain, under that harassment, would simply die faster. When the army reached Turan, the first planned stop, where water was supposed to be found, they discovered the springs had been seized by Saladin's forces. There was no way to reach the water without fighting on unfavorable ground, with an already weakened army under constant archer fire. The decision was made to keep marching. There was no other option. By afternoon, the army had advanced perhaps 15 of the 25 kilometers, but the losses in terms of morale, energy, and cohesion were immense. The infantry was fragmented. The cavalry had spent the entire day resisting the urge to pursue the Muslim archers, and that discipline had come at a cost. Exhausted men inside armor too hot to touch, and the horses kept deteriorating. It was here that Raymond of Tripoli, at the vanguard of the army, assessed the situation and made the only decision that remained to be made. It was too late to reach Tiberias today. The army needed to stop. The question was where. There was a rise ahead, a volcanic ridge with two rocky outcroppings the locals called the Horns of Hattin. It was not an ideal defensive position. There was no water. There was no meaningful shade. Its only advantage was the elevation, high ground that would make cavalry attacks marginally more difficult. It was the best available. The army halted. Saladin watched from above and did exactly what any shrewd general would do. He tightened the siege. Muslim cavalry took up positions around the ridge, completing the encirclement. The springs along the route to the Sea of Galilee were blocked. The Crusader army was surrounded on a waterless hill. And then Saladin added an element that turned discomfort into nightmare. During the night, his forces set fire to the dry vegetation around the Crusader camp. The dead summer grass of the Levant caught easily, and the wind drove the smoke directly into the Crusader ranks. Men who could not sleep for thirst now could not breathe either. The horses, already at the limits of physical endurance, panicked at the flames. Animals that had awaited the next day's battle became impossible to control in the darkness. The knights tied them down, calmed them, followed them through the dark, trying to prevent them from toppling equipment or injuring other men. The night of July 3rd to 4th, 1187, was spent under smoke, thirst, and the sound of Saladin's forces moving in the darkness around the ridge. A knight who survived described that night with a precision that needs no dramatization. The men were screaming for water, and there was only fire all around them. The most devout prayed. The others simply tried to survive until dawn. When the sun rose on July 4th, the trap was completely shut. The Crusader army was cornered on an arid ridge, surrounded on all sides, dehydrated, disoriented, and partially disorganized. Raymond had told the council that by the time they arrived, the army would already be broken. The battle the following morning would be merely the confirmation. He had been right. The Horns of Hattin were, from a defensive standpoint, one of the most deceptive positions in the Holy Land. The name suggests high ground, and indeed there is high ground. But the two volcanic protrusions that give the ridge its name had no water sources, no shade, no defensible perimeter that would prevent a superior army from simply climbing up the flanks. In practice, the Crusaders had not reached a defensible position. They had walked into a trap. The Battle of July 4th began at dawn. The infantry, which had spent the night without water and beneath a veil of smoke, was in moral collapse. Some contingents attempted to advance collectively down the ridge, toward where they believed water might be found, most likely toward the Sea of Galilee. It was a desperate, uncoordinated movement, and the Muslim forces waiting at the base of the slope met them with arrows and spears. King Guy ordered the infantry to stop and return to formation. Messengers were dispatched, but the infantry, disoriented, parched, under constant attack, did not comply with any consistency. Some returned. Many did not. With the infantry disintegrating, the cavalry lost the protection it had provided against the archers. The Knights Templar and Hospitaller, the finest fighters in the army, attempted to do what heavy cavalry does: charges that break enemy formations. The charges failed. Not because the Crusader Knights were incompetent, They were precisely the opposite. But horses that had not drunk in 2 days do not charge as fast. And those still moving with any strength were shadows of the animals that had set out from Sapphira. Knights who had spent the night sleepless, without water, breathing smoke, do not sustain the physical momentum that a charge demands. And the Muslim forces surrounding the ridge refused to receive the charge from a fixed position. They fell back, dispersed, and regrouped, never offering a stationary target that heavy cavalry could destroy. The tactic was the same one that had worked throughout the previous day. Denial of decisive battle, constant harassment, attrition. But this time, there was nowhere left to march. It was then that Raymond of Tripoli, leading the army's vanguard with his contingent, forced his way through the Muslim line to the northwest. His group broke through the encirclement and escaped. Saladin's forces opened a path, perhaps deliberately, to complete the isolation of the army's core, and Raymond and his knights rode free. The man who had seen the trap more clearly than anyone else was the only senior commander to survive the day. For the remaining army, the afternoon of July 4th was the methodical dissolution of a fighting force. The infantry had virtually ceased to exist as a combat unit. It was dead, surrendered, or scattered across the slopes. The knights kept fighting. It is what knights do. But each charge they launched was shorter, weaker, easier for the surrounding Muslim forces to absorb. King Guy retreated to the royal red tent that had been pitched at the top of the ridge, the tent becoming a visual landmark for both sides, a shrinking symbol of resistance. At a certain point, a Muslim observer recorded that the tent was brought down, and immediately the Crusader resistance around it ceased. King Guy of Lusignan was captured, Gerard of Riedfort was captured, and then, amid the destruction, something happened that, for the Christian world of the time, was more devastating than any human loss: the true cross. The full magnitude of that loss can only be understood when we remember what the relic meant to the Crusader army and to the entire Christian world. The relic was, according to tradition, a fragment of the original cross on which Jesus had been crucified. It was the supreme symbol of the Crusader Holy War, a guarantee of divine protection, a spiritual anchor for an army fighting in the name of faith. Carried onto the battlefield, it transformed a military campaign into something more: a mission, a promise, a covenant between the warriors and their God. When the true cross entered battle, defeat was not merely unlikely, it was unthinkable. When it fell into the hands of Saladin's forces, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. It was not simply a piece of wood captured by the enemy. It was proof, for every crusader who held to his faith, that God had withdrawn his protection. That this battle had not merely been a military defeat, it had been a judgment. The relic was sent to Damascus, and it was never seen again. Its whereabouts remain unknown to this day. Across the entire history of the Crusades, the true cross is the only sacred object of comparable significance that simply vanished, without negotiation, without ransom, without any trace reaching the modern historical record. The uncertainty surrounding its fate is, in itself, a form of psychological damage that has persisted 8 centuries on. Meanwhile, Saladin processed the prisoners according to a logic that was not random cruelty. It was a strategic statement. King Guy was granted treatment befitting his status. He would be spared, eventually ransomed. Guy was a political piece, not a permanent threat. A captured king held exchange value, and Saladin was a man who understood value. For the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, the logic was different. Saladin ordered all those captured to be executed, not as arbitrary punishment, as an ideological statement. The military orders were, to Saladin, the most dangerous and irreconcilable fighters in the Christian world. They were monastic warriors who could not be bought, who could not be corrupted, who would not negotiate. Keeping them alive was a risk he was not willing to take. The Templars and Hospitallers were executed in the field, most often by religious students and Sufi mystics whom Saladin had brought with him, a deliberately symbolic gesture, placing men of faith to do the work rather than soldiers. The death of the Crusader monastic warriors at the hands of Muslim spiritual warriors was a message any medieval observer would have interpreted immediately. The common soldiers were enslaved, The captives were taken to Damascus. From an army of 20,000 men, the largest field army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled, there was practically nothing left. The dead were on the ridge. The captives would not return. The fugitives were few. In a single July afternoon, the military capacity of the kingdom had been erased. The army was destroyed. But Saladin was not finished. He had 87 days, and he planned to use every one of them. The theory that had guided Saladin's entire strategy was this: destroy the field army, and the kingdom dies without further resistance. The fortresses, without an army to relieve them, were merely a matter of time. In the 87 days that followed, that theory was proven with a precision that would have been almost mechanical were it not for the human scale of what was happening. Acre was the first major city to fall. It was the kingdom's most important port, the economic heart of the Latin East, the landing point for warriors and supplies coming from Europe, the place where the kingdom breathed. No city on the coast held greater strategic value, and the men defending it knew all of this. They also knew that the army that was supposed to come to their relief had been destroyed at Hattin. When Saladin appeared before their walls, there was no denial. There was calculation. How long can we hold, with what we have, with no prospect of relief? The answer was 1 week. In 1 week, Acre negotiated its surrender. The pattern that repeated itself was almost inevitable. Beirut, Sidon, Ascalon, Jaffa. In each city, the sequence was the same. The garrison assessed what it had, assessed what was coming, calculated the time available before supplies ran out, and then sent envoys to negotiate. Saladin, in most cases, was generous. He accepted conditional surrenders, allowed populations to leave, honored the agreed terms. This was not merely benevolence, it was strategy. Cities that saw their neighbors treated well surrendered more quickly. Prolonged resistance made sieges costly. Generosity accelerated conquest. Within roughly 6 weeks of Hattin, the eastern Mediterranean coastline had changed hands almost without a fight. Not because the cities were weak, because the entire system had been designed to depend on an army that no longer existed. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin's army arrived at the walls of Jerusalem. The city had a garrison, had walls, had water, but it had no illusions. Without a field army to relieve the siege, the question was not whether Jerusalem would fall. It was when and on what terms. The defenders held out for 2 weeks. Then they negotiated. On October 2nd, 1187, 87 days after the Battle of Hattin, Jerusalem surrendered. The terms were unusual for the standards of the age. Christians who could pay a ransom were freed. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was preserved. There was a silent comparison in all of this. When the Crusaders had conquered Jerusalem in 1099, they had massacred much of the population. The contrast did not go unnoticed by contemporaries, and Saladin knew it would not. The fall of Jerusalem shocked the medieval Christian world. Pope Gregory VIII issued a papal bull calling for a new crusade. In 1189, the Third Crusade was launched. Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, Frederick I. They managed to reclaim parts of the coast, but Jerusalem never returned to Christian hands during the age of the Crusades. The Battle of Hattin was not merely a military victory, it was the end of an era. Saladin did not discover this by accident. Every piece of what you just witnessed was architecture. At the beginning of this video, I said this was not the story you thought you knew. You probably expected a battle. What you saw was a trap. The battle was merely the moment it snapped shut. The secret lay in the terrain. It lay in the thirst. It lay in a council meeting that took place on the night of July 2nd, 1187, and in the political psychology that determined it. Saladin won the Battle of Hattin before Hattin existed. When the Crusader army marched out of Safaria on the morning of July 3rd, the battle was already decided. What happened over the following 2 days was merely the process by which a decision already made became concrete. 4 principles define what Saladin did, and each of them transcends the medieval period. The first, in a state without strategic depth, the army and the state are the same thing. Destroy the army, and the state collapses through inertia. Saladin understood this about the Kingdom of Jerusalem before any Crusader articulated it with clarity. The entire campaign was designed around that insight. The second, arid terrain is a weapon if you control the water, and your enemy does not. Turning this principle into a campaign demands something harder than the principle itself. The patience to wait for the enemy to enter the right terrain, and the discipline not to attack before thirst does the work for you. The third, political fracture within the enemy camp is a force multiplier. Saladin did not create the division between Guy and Raymond. It already existed. What he did was engineer a situation where that division would produce the outcome he wanted, where the more aggressive, less strategic faction would naturally make the wrong decision, and the more prudent faction would be silenced by the very logic of the situation. The fourth, the battle must be won before it begins. This is the hardest to accept, because it contradicts the narrative that battles are decided by valor, by numbers, by chance. Hatton was decided by logistics, by terrain, and by internal politics, none of which were visible on the battlefield itself. These four principles are not medieval curiosities. They are the foundation of any strategy that seeks to reduce the role of chance to an absolute minimum, that attempts, before the first confrontation, to create conditions in which victory is nearly inevitable. Saladin built this over 15 years, and it worked in 2 days. On July 4th, 1187, the sun rose over a barren ridge and found an army already dead, not by the blows of that day, but by the decision of one night. Hatton is not a battle about courage or betrayal. It is a lesson about what happens when strategy meets political psychology, and psychology wins. If this video made you see Hatton differently, not as a battle, but as the conclusion of a trap that took 15 years to build, then share it with someone who appreciates military history. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, now is the moment. History is full of wars won before they begin.